Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and we're taking a look today at the Blackmagic Cloud Pod. The best way to describe this is as a mini NAS for video creators, and what it lets you do is connect up external solid-state drives like these to the two USB Type-C ports here on the back, and then you connect this up to a 10 gig Ethernet network, and you're able to access those drives with pretty good performance over your local network. And there's also some Dropbox syncing in the mix as well. It's got a very narrow use case, but we're going to explore its performance and talk about who might need something like this in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that I paid for this with my own funds. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. No one is paying for this review, nor has anyone reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what the Cloud Pod is all about. Now, the price point on this is $395. It's a pretty simple unit. You just plug it into your network, plug your drives in, and you are off and running. There is a drive indicator light here on the top that you'll see operating when we get things going. On the back is where all the action is. So you've got a 12-volt DC input on here. It does come with a 60-watt power supply. This is where your 10 gig Ethernet will connect to. It also works on 1 gigabit networks. A little bit earlier, I tested it on a 2.5 gigabit network, and it was able to run at 2.5. So this is going to vary its speed based on what you connect things to, but we will connect it to a 10 gig network to test things out in a minute. These are where your two drives connect to. Unfortunately, these are USB Type-C Gen 1 ports, which means the maximum that these ports will run at is 5 gigabits per second. Now, most of the drives you'll encounter out on the market, like these two, run at Gen 2 speeds. So what I'm finding, for the most part, is that your drives will run at about half the rate of speed on the Cloud Pod as they would directly connected to your computer. And I'll show you some examples of the maximum performance you can expect in a few minutes. The last port here is an oddball. This is an HDMI port, but it is not for video ingest. What this does is it outputs a status screen about the health and activity of your Cloud Pod device, and it is a view-only thing. There's no way to interact with the device through the HDMI either. So what we're going to do now is boot this up. We'll take a look at that control panel and also look at how it performs. All right, before we test everything, let me just show you what I've got set up here for our test environment. I have a QNAP switch that I bought a little while back. This supports 10 gig and 2.5 gig connections, and on the 10 gig leg here, I have my MacBook Pro 14 connected up with a 10 gig Ethernet adapter via Thunderbolt. And then I also have the Cloud Pod connected to the other 10 gig port. So we're going to be able to get full speed between the Mac and the Cloud Pod here for our testing. I also have the switch connected up to the rest of my network here so we can get back and forth to the internet if we need to. Additionally, I've got some drives connected. This is a do-it-yourselfer. This is an ACASYS enclosure that works with NVMe drives, and I have a Samsung NVMe inside of it. When this drive is connected to a Thunderbolt-equipped PC, it works as a Thunderbolt drive, but when it's connected to something that only has USB Type-C, it works as a USB drive. So even though we've got a Thunderbolt cable connected to it, it is currently working as a USB drive with the Cloud Pod here. And Thunderbolt cables, by the way, are the most compatible USB-C cables you'll find. They support everything, including full power and display. I also have a Samsung T7 here. This is another SSD that's very popular. This is connected up via USB Type-C to the other USB port on the back of the Cloud Pod. So let's start out with a little speed test, and then we'll see how we can configure this thing. So we're going to start off with Blackmagic's own disk speed test to see what kind of speeds we can get on this thing. And what I'm going to do here is just look for the drive on my network as I point the speed test at the Cloud Pod. And if I go over here to our network locations, you will see the Blackmagic Cloud Pod shows up like any other device might on my network. It's very much like a NAS in that regard, but there is no security. So I can connect here without a username and start editing and adding files or deleting them from the drive that's connected. But in this case, of course, we're going to do something a little less harmful, which is run a speed test. So I'm going to click Start here. And as you can see on the do-it-yourself drive there, we're getting about 418 megabytes per second. And that's about the max that you're going to see out of this thing in either direction. And that's because these are USB Gen 1 ports on here. So even though these drives can go faster, this is the maximum we're going to see on the CloudPod. What I'm going to do now, though, is move this over a little bit. And I have a second instance running, and I'm going to connect to the other drive here real quick. So we've now got the test running on both of these drives at the same time. And as you can see, there really isn't a performance penalty for doing simultaneous data transfer here. So we are just getting done with the right portion of that test. Now we're reading. You can see both drives are reading at about 600 megabytes per second or so, getting very close to maximizing that 10 gig connection. And I'll wait for it to cycle back over to the rights here so you can get a sense for that. And as you can see, both drives are writing out pretty much at the full speed that those USB connections can accommodate. I also ran it a little bit earlier where I had one writing while the other one was reading, and again I was seeing similar speeds here. So these two USB ports on the back are not sharing the bus. They are uniquely connected so that the performance out of each drive can be fully realized simultaneously. And then of course we're pushing that out via the 10 gig connection. Now while this test is running, what I can also do is show you the control panel that you get out the back of the HDMI. So here you can get an idea as to who's connected to your drive, how much storage you have available on your drives, and you can also get a readout of your total data transfer right now. So you can see that we are, looks like currently reading at about 5 gigabits per second over that network, and when it switches back to the right portion of the test, you'll see that graph there switch directions. So now we're writing, and as you can see, we're writing out at a slightly faster rate of speed versus the read. The max that I've seen this thing get to is about what you're seeing right now, which is about 7 gigabits per second, give or take. So it's never going to get to the full 10 gig, and that's due to USB and Ethernet overhead. I do think this control panel is really cool looking, and I can see a lot of production houses maybe just having this on a monitor somewhere because it does look cool, but it is largely just informational, and there's no way to change any settings on this control panel while it's running. But you can change settings on a computer, and in order to get into the settings on this device, you have to install software. There's no web-based control panel like you might find on a network-attached storage device, and that software at the moment only runs on Mac and Windows. Let's take a look at that. So here is the Cloud Core setup software, and this will work with the CloudPod along with some of the more expensive storage devices that Blackmagic is selling. And what you can do here is click on this button to get into your configuration screen. Now by default, the only way you can adjust settings on the CloudPod is to connect it from one of its USB ports to your computer. This is the only security feature that this thing has for the most part. But you can switch it over like I did to Ethernet so that you can configure it over the network if you want. So you can see here just very basic settings, time and date. You can set it to a static IP if you want, and then you can factory reset it. I have Dropbox Sync set up right now. On the box for the CloudPod, it says it supports Google Drive, but right now, at the time I'm recording this video, it only supports Dropbox. And the configuration for the synchronization is relatively simple. You point it at a folder on one of the two drives that it is connected to, and then tell it where on Dropbox you want to sync things up with. And you can have multiple sync points, so you could have different projects synchronized in different ways. You have 3 options for the type of synchronization. Default is a 2-way, but you can also set up a 1-way sync if that's what you're looking to do. There's also a provision here for syncing only proxy files versus the originals. And this works with some Blackmagic software that will look at a folder and automatically create proxy files whenever original videos get dropped into it. The documentation, though, wasn't very clear about how this feature works, and I think it's mostly designed for DaVinci Resolve. But if you are working with a lot of proxy files, you can simplify and maybe streamline your synchronization by having this feature enabled and activated. And then on the storage tab, you've got your only security feature, which is the ability to make this device a read-only device, and this is not drive specific. So when you enable this, both drives are read-only. You can't choose one versus the other, so just be aware of that. Another thing you have to be careful about, beyond just putting this thing on your network so everybody can use it, is that there is no eject mechanism for the drive. So if you are working on projects, you're going to need to go around the office and make sure everybody is saved and out before you pull the plug on it, because there's no way to safely eject. So what you have to do is, of course, look to see if the activity light is not on. You can see it reading and writing here as I am running another speed test. And then you need to go into the control panel here on the HDMI to make sure that nobody is actively reading and writing. As you can see on the left-hand side there, it shows me which users are active on the CloudPod here. So it's a very kind of old-fashioned way of ensuring that things are done. You have to go around and call everybody before you pull the drive out. So let's take a look now at a more practical use case, actually editing video over the network using the CloudPod. So we're going to load up a multi-camera demo I've got here in Final Cut Pro, and this is coming over the 10 gig network from one of the drives connected to the CloudPod. And as you can see here, things are playing back very smoothly. This is a 2-angle 4K 60 project. This is a ProRes 422 file on both. And as you can see here, things are playing back just fine. And I'll pull up the control panel here so you can see what kind of bandwidth we're pulling. And it looks as though we're doing about 2.5 gigabits per second on the reads, maybe a little less than that. I have found sometimes, though, like when things like this title pop up, sometimes it uses a little more bandwidth. So you can see we're getting close to 3 gigabits per second there, and things are slowing down. And that's due to the USB limitations of the drives as they're connected over that Gen 1 connection. So if you are doing multi-angle stuff like this, I think this is where you're going to need to edit with proxy files, especially at 4K. I definitely could not do a third angle here if we were also using 4K 60 for our third angle input file. So there are some limitations to this, but for proxies it should work just fine, and I think largely that's what this is designed for. And it's also kind of fun to move things around and then watch as the control panel responds. So for example, I just moved that title over and it has to re-render, so you can see those little yellow dots there writing to the disk as it renders out that title again. And it's just kind of fun to watch this stuff go and get a feel for what kind of bandwidth is going through your drives when you're doing basic editing work. But it seems to work fine if you are doing this kind of thing. If you have 2 different projects on 2 different drives and 2 different editors working off of those individual drives, I think they will have a good experience. But if you start piling on more people into the same folders, that's when things will probably get bogged down due to the USB bandwidth limitations and the bandwidth limitations of the 10 gig network. Now, as far as drive formats are concerned, it supports exFAT and HFS+, and that is it at the moment. For the most part, drives that are coming in from a recorder will likely have exFAT as their drive format. But if you plug in an NTFS drive or an APFS drive, you're going to not see that drive mount on the unit because its file system support is quite limited. So the big question is, who or what is this device for? And I think it's best suited for small production teams that don't have a lot of IT support and want something really simple to get proxies and original media shared with multiple users on a network at the same time with a good amount of performance. And from that standpoint, it accomplishes that quite well. I was pleased with the fact that we can hit both drives simultaneously and get the full speed of this limited USB connection out of both. And that is something that a lot of NAS devices don't do very well, and a lot of docking stations don't do very well because they often put the USB ports on the same bus. But with simplicity always comes some security concerns, and this thing is very insecure because there are no passwords involved with it. It is a dumb SMB server, and anything that can access SMB connections, like any Windows or Mac PC, will be able to see the drives here and by default write to them, delete things, and change things. And you have to be really careful about who has access to this. You're not going to have any real issues with people coming in from the outside because it doesn't have any cloud functionality. It's not going to poke a hole in your firewall, for example, but the local network is always an area that you have to be careful about as well. But if you are working with a small team, you can buy yourself a cheap 10 gig dumb switch, or a relatively cheap one, and get everybody working off the same media the minute it comes in from the field without having to wait for it to copy first. So if you wanted to consolidate your workflow while you're out in the field doing some editing for a last-minute production or something, I think this can really fill that kind of need. So there are use cases for this, and I think if you're watching this, you're probably thinking about some of those use cases. But for a general consumer, this is probably not something I would recommend, and it's certainly not going to replace a network-attached storage device that can provide greater capacity along with greater security and a bunch of other features as well. That's going to do it for this look at the CloudPod. And until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold-level supporters Jim Tanis and Tom Albrecht, Hot Sauce and Video Games and Eric's Variety Channel, Brian Parker and Frank Goldman, Amda Brown and Matt Zagaya, and Chris Allegretta. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.